November 1942. Berlin, Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. Reichsminister Joseph Goebbels studied a collection of Allied propaganda posters spread across his mahogany desk, his usual confidence replaced by grudging recognition of a troubling reality. His staff had collected them from neutral countries where both Axis and Allied posters competed for public opinion. Switzerland, Sweden, Spain, Turkey, Portugal. Places where effectiveness could be measured by observable shifts in public sentiment, newspaper editorials, and government policy decisions. The Allied posters were winning. Goebbels's confidential memo to his department heads that evening revealed a rare acknowledgement of failure from the master propagandist. The enemy has developed poster propaganda of unexpected sophistication and psychological effectiveness. Their designs are deceptively simple, their messages remarkably direct, their emotional appeals devastatingly effective. Our posters emphasize raw power, historical destiny, and ideological superiority. Theirs emphasize personal freedom, protection of home and family, and individual stake in the outcome. In neutral countries where audiences can freely choose which message resonates, their approach proves more effective than ours. We must either adapt our methods or concede this crucial battleground of the propaganda war. The admission was remarkable. The master propagandist, who had pioneered modern totalitarian communication techniques, recognizing that his opponents had developed methods superior to his own, that raw power projection and technical brilliance couldn't overcome messages that connected authentically with fundamental human desires and concerns. Nazi Germany had pioneered modern propaganda posters during the 1920s and 1930s, using bold graphics, dramatic imagery, and sophisticated design to communicate party ideology and consolidate power. The posters had been instrumental in Nazi rise to power, plastering German cities with images of strength, unity, and historical destiny that promised to restore German greatness after the humiliation of Versailles. By 1939, German poster design was considered the most advanced in the world. Technically brilliant, psychologically sophisticated, professionally produced, using state-of-the-art lithographic techniques. Allied posters in 1939-1940 were, by comparison, embarrassingly amateurish. Clumsy messaging that missed the mark, patronizing tone that alienated audiences, designs that insulted viewer intelligence rather than engaging it. British posters like "Your courage, your cheerfulness, your resolution will bring us victory" were disasters that embarrassed their creators and damaged government credibility. American posters before Pearl Harbor were barely better. Government-produced designs that looked bureaucratic and felt like heavy-handed propaganda rather than genuine persuasion. But by 1942 to 1943, Allied poster propaganda had evolved dramatically through systematic learning and professional expertise. British, American, Canadian, and other Allied designers had learned through painful trial and error what worked and what spectacularly didn't. They'd discovered that honesty about difficulties was more effective than grandiose claims, that humor worked better than intimidation, that appealing to personal motivations trumped abstract ideological commitment, and that treating audiences as intelligent partners rather than subjects to be commanded generated genuine engagement rather than resentful compliance. The transformation was so complete that Nazi propagandists found themselves studying Allied techniques with growing concern, trying to understand how their enemies had turned poster propaganda from embarrassing weakness into sophisticated strength. The story of how Allied posters outsmarted Nazi propaganda reveals fundamental truths about persuasive communication, mass psychology, and the crucial difference between propaganda that imposes ideology through authority and propaganda that persuades through authentic connection to audience values and concerns. The Nazi poster tradition, power and ideology. Nazi poster design had deep roots in 1920s German political culture, where posters were the primary means of mass communication before radio and cinema became widespread media. Political parties competed through poster campaigns that covered city walls, designated advertising columns, and public spaces with competing messages and visual imagery. The Nazi Party's early posters, designed by artists like Mjölnir, Hans Schweitzer, and Ludwig Hohlwein, established a distinctive visual language that would define Nazi aesthetics for the next 2 decades. These designers created imagery that was immediately recognizable and psychologically powerful, even when the ideology it served was repugnant. The visual vocabulary was distinctive and carefully calculated. Bold red, white, and black color schemes derived directly from the Nazi flag and chosen for maximum visual impact. Dramatic compositions using diagonal lines and dynamic angles, suggesting movement and inevitable progress. Heroic figures shown from low camera angles to appear larger than life and superhuman. Gothic typography that connected the Nazi movement to German medieval traditions and suggested deep historical roots. And massive scale. Many posters measured 3 feet by 4 feet or larger, impossible to ignore when displayed publicly. Mjölnir, who became the primary poster designer for the Nazi Party from the mid-1920s onward, developed a style that was instantly identifiable across Germany. His posters featured muscular workers wielding sledgehammers as instruments of creative destruction, soldiers with granite-hard, determined expressions suggesting unbreakable will, and Hitler portrayed as a messianic figure bathed in light from above, leading Germany toward its historical destiny. The imagery was aggressively masculine, uncompromising, and designed to project strength and historical inevitability rather than invite discussion or debate. Ludwig Hohlwein, originally a successful commercial designer who adapted his considerable artistic talents to serve Nazi propaganda, brought sophisticated modernist design techniques to party posters. His work used simplified forms, dramatic lighting effects, and powerful compositions that made Nazi imagery look professional, contemporary, and forward-looking, rather than reactionary or nostalgic. Hohlwein's technical mastery gave Nazi propaganda a veneer of aesthetic sophistication that made it more palatable to educated middle-class Germans who might otherwise have dismissed Nazi messaging as crude rabble-rousing. The posters emphasized several consistent themes that remained central to Nazi propaganda throughout the Third Reich's existence. Racial superiority demonstrated through idealized Aryan figures with blonde hair, blue eyes, and classical Nordic features that supposedly proved German racial perfection and justified domination over inferior peoples. Military power displayed prominently through soldiers carrying weapons, tanks rolling inexorably forward, aircraft flying overhead in perfect formation, all suggesting unstoppable German military might that would sweep away all opposition. Hitler as semi-divine leader portrayed towering over adoring masses, standing alone against dramatic sky and clouds, or bathed in light suggesting divine favor, imagery deliberately borrowed from religious art to create quasi-religious worship of the Führer as Germany's savior. Enemies portrayed systematically as subhuman threats, Jews shown as sinister conspirators with exaggerated stereotypical features, Bolsheviks depicted as destructive chaos threatening civilization itself, Western democracies portrayed as decadent and weak, collapsing from internal corruption and racial degeneration. A particularly striking 1939 poster by Mjölnir titled Sieg jeden Preis, Victory at Any Price, showed a German soldier in dramatic profile, his jaw set with absolute determination, his eyes focused unwaveringly on the distant horizon. golden sunlight breaking through storm clouds behind him. The composition brilliantly suggested that nothing could stop German advance, that victory was inevitable through sheer force of superior German will, that German soldiers were superhuman warriors who would prevail regardless of obstacles or opposition. Another poster from 1940, designed specifically for distribution in occupied Netherlands, showed powerful hands breaking heavy chains with the word bevrijding, liberation, in large dramatic letters. The poster audaciously claimed that German occupation actually liberated Dutch people from British economic exploitation and Jewish financial control, turning military conquest into supposed liberation. The design was sophisticated. The breaking chain symbol cleverly suggested freedom rather than subjugation. The professional typography and high-quality printing suggested German organizational superiority, and the multilingual message attempted to portray conquest as something Dutch people should welcome rather than resist. The technical quality of Nazi posters was genuinely impressive by any objective standard. They used sophisticated color lithography that produced rich, vibrant colors and sharp details that captured attention immediately. They employed dramatic lighting effects, chiaroscuro techniques that made subjects pop dramatically from backgrounds, directional lighting that created heroic shadows and emphasized power, and spotlighting effects that focused attention inexorably on key elements. They featured dynamic compositions that drew the eye naturally through the design, diagonal lines suggesting forward movement and progress, triangular arrangements suggesting stability and strength, and dramatic perspective making subjects appear monumental and overwhelming. The production quality matched the design sophistication. Nazi posters were printed on high-quality paper, using professional lithographic presses that produced sharp, consistent images across thousands of copies. The printing was multicolor, often using 5 or 6 separate plates to achieve rich color palettes that were visually striking. The posters were typically large, many measured 33 inches by 47 inches or even larger, making them physically impossible to ignore when displayed in public spaces. Distribution was systematic, comprehensive, and centrally coordinated. Posters were displayed in every German city and town according to carefully planned campaigns, posted on specially designated advertising columns called Litfaßsäulen that dotted urban landscapes, placed prominently in shop windows where they would be seen by thousands of passers-by, hung in factories where workers would see them daily, positioned in schools where they would shape young minds, and strategically located at transportation hubs where commuters and travelers would encounter them repeatedly. The Reich Propaganda Directorate coordinated poster campaigns nationally to ensure absolutely consistent messaging across the entire nation, preventing any deviation from approved narratives. The posters were undeniably effective within Germany itself, where the population had been conditioned to Nazi imagery for years and where no competing messages or alternative narratives were permitted to exist. They reinforced existing beliefs among true believers, intimidated potential dissenters into public silence, if not actual agreement, celebrated military victories in ways that boosted morale, and maintained commitment through carefully constructed alternate reality, where Germany was always winning, always righteous, and always destined for ultimate triumph. But the posters had fundamental weaknesses that Nazi designers didn't recognize because they'd never had to compete against effective opposition in a free marketplace of ideas. They emphasized raw power rather than genuine persuasion, assuming that displays of overwhelming strength would inspire loyalty and support, when often they actually inspired fear and resentment instead. They assumed that audience everywhere wanted what Germans supposedly wanted: conquest, racial dominance, authoritarian leadership, subordination to collective will, when actually most audiences wanted safety, prosperity, self-determination, and peaceful family life. They relied heavily on intimidation when genuine persuasion would have been far more effective at winning neutral support and genuine commitment. They projected ideology that many audiences outside Germany found fundamentally alien or actively threatening, racial theories that justified murder, cult of leadership that demanded unthinking obedience, glorification of violence as purifying and regenerative. These fundamental weaknesses became glaringly apparent when Nazi posters competed directly with Allied designs in neutral countries, where audiences weren't captive, where both sides' messages were available, and where people could freely choose which narrative resonated with their values and concerns without fear of punishment for making the wrong choice. Early Allied failures. Learning through disaster. Allied poster propaganda in 1939 to 1940 was catastrophically ineffective, revealing just how poorly democratic governments initially understood mass psychology and persuasive communication. The failures were deeply embarrassing at the time and damaged government credibility, but they proved instructive in retrospect. They showed clearly what didn't work and forced a painful but necessary learning process that eventually produced highly effective propaganda. Britain's Ministry of Information, hastily created in September 1939 under Lord Macmillan, a distinguished jurist who had absolutely no experience with mass media or propaganda techniques, commissioned posters that became legendary examples of how not to communicate with your own population. Your courage, your cheerfulness, your resolution will bring us victory was perhaps the single most disastrous poster of the entire early war period and became a cautionary tale studied by subsequent propagandists. The poster featured simple text design with the message displayed in serif typeface against a plain red background, visually boring and unengaging. But that wasn't even the main problem. The problem was the message itself and what it communicated about class relationships. The us versus you phrasing created immediate class resentment that the designers had completely failed to anticipate. Working-class Britons read it as, "Your courage, your sacrifice, your suffering, and your dying will bring victory to us." The ruling class and political elites who will take credit for your sacrifices while remaining safely distant from danger ourselves. The poster seemed to crystallize everything workers resented about class privilege. The expectation that ordinary people would do the suffering and dying while their supposed betters would reap the benefits and glory. The poster appeared in shops, factories, canteens, and public spaces where it was immediately and mercilessly mocked. Workers defaced copies with sardonic additions like, "and our money and our lives while you stay safe," or simply, "but not for you lot." Satirical magazines like Punch published devastating parodies showing wealthy people in evening dress, relaxing in comfortable drawing rooms with champagne, while workers labored in factories and soldiers died in trenches, with the caption mocking the poster's message. The poster became a symbol of government incompetence, class insensitivity, and complete disconnection from ordinary people's attitudes and concerns. The ministry quickly and quietly withdrew the poster from circulation, but the damage to the ministry's reputation was severe and lasting. The incident established the Ministry of Information's early reputation as an organization that produced propaganda so tone-deaf and counterproductive that it actually undermined morale rather than supporting it, exactly the opposite of its intended purpose. "Freedom is in peril, defend it with all your might" was another early disaster that revealed government's profound failure to communicate effectively with the population it was supposedly trying to mobilize. The poster featured bold typography with "Freedom is in peril" in large dramatic letters, and "defend it with all your might" below, all displayed against a solid color background. visually more striking than the previous disaster, but still fundamentally flawed in its approach. The central problem was vague abstraction that provided no useful guidance whatsoever. What exactly was freedom in concrete terms that ordinary people could understand and relate to? How specifically should ordinary civilians defend it? What concrete actions did the government want people to take? What threats to freedom should people be watching for? The poster answered precisely none of these practical questions, leaving people frustrated at being lectured about their patriotic duty without being given any useful information about what they should actually do to fulfill that duty. Workers and civilians desperately wanted to know, what should I actually do to help? How do I defend freedom in practical terms? What specific actions does the government want from me? Should I join the military, volunteer for civil defense, increase production at my factory, reduce consumption, report suspicious activity? The poster provided no answers, no guidance, no concrete direction, leaving people feeling that they were being harangued and lectured at without being treated as intelligent partners who deserved clear information and specific requests. Keep calm and carry on, now ironically famous and commercially exploited through modern reproduction on tea towels, mugs, and countless other products, was actually never publicly distributed during the war except in extremely limited circumstances, which itself reveals government's eventual recognition that it was poor propaganda. The poster was designed in 1939, printed in truly massive quantities of approximately 2.5 million copies, but then held in reserve for use only after German invasion of Britain actually occurred, an eventuality that thankfully never materialized. The fact that it wasn't used except in the most minimal way suggests that government officials eventually recognized it would be received as poorly as the other early disasters if widely distributed. The imperative tone, keep calm as a command, sounded like an order from distant authority, rather than advice from a trusted source trying to help. The phrase carry on was far too vague. Carry on doing what exactly? Going to work, maintaining normal routines, continuing to resist? The lack of any specific guidance made it feel like an empty slogan rather than useful communication. The crown symbol prominently displayed at the top reinforced uncomfortable class implications. This was the monarchy telling subjects what to do rather than democratic government offering useful guidance to citizens who were equal partners in the war effort. The poster would very likely have been received just as poorly as the Your Courage disaster if it had been widely distributed to a population that was already suspicious of government propaganda after earlier failures. American posters from 1940–1941, during the period before Pearl Harbor brought the United States into direct military involvement, were barely better than early British disasters. The posters used heavy-handed symbolism that felt dated and propagandistic even when first produced, suggesting that American designers were repeating mistakes the British were already learning to avoid. James Montgomery Flagg's famous Uncle Sam poster, "I Want You for U.S. Army," had been originally created in 1917 for World War I recruitment and was simply reprinted with minor modifications for World War II. The recycling of 25-year-old imagery suggested a serious lack of creativity and made the poster feel like a leftover relic from the previous war, rather than a fresh call to action for a new conflict with different stakes and circumstances. The Uncle Sam imagery itself was increasingly problematic for 1940s audiences who had grown more sophisticated about propaganda techniques. The stern old man, pointing accusingly and aggressively at the viewer, felt confrontational and coercive rather than inspiring or inviting. The pose suggested command and coercion. You will serve whether you want to or not. Your consent is irrelevant, rather than an invitation to voluntarily join a worthy cause that served both personal and national interests. Other early American posters featured eagles clutching olive branches in their talons, Lady Liberty holding her torch aloft against dramatic sunsets, and other patriotic symbols borrowed directly from 19th century political cartoons that looked increasingly dated and irrelevant in the 1940s context of mechanized total war. The imagery was abstract and disconnected from ordinary people's actual concerns about their families, their jobs, their safety, and their futures. The posters talked at audiences in authoritative voice rather than talking to them as equals. They commanded compliance rather than persuading cooperation through appeal to shared values and interests. They assumed that abstract patriotic duty was sufficient motivation without addressing legitimate personal concerns about physical safety, family economic security during wartime disruption, what the sacrifice would actually achieve, or how individual contribution would make meaningful difference to the war's outcome. Early American designers made exactly the same fundamental mistake as their British counterparts, treating audiences as subjects to be commanded and mobilized rather than as citizens to be persuaded and engaged as partners in a shared national effort. The approach was not only ineffective, but sometimes actively counterproductive, generating resentment and resistance rather than enthusiasm and voluntary cooperation. These early disasters across both British and American poster campaigns taught several crucial lessons that would fundamentally transform Allied propaganda. Audiences deeply resented being lectured at or commanded, especially when commands came from authorities who seemed disconnected from ordinary people's lives and concerns. Abstract patriotic appeals were dramatically less effective than concrete personal relevance that connected to viewers' actual lives, families, and concerns. Commanding compliance didn't work nearly as well as persuading cooperation through appeal to self-interest and shared values. Telling people what to do generated resistance and resentment, while explaining why they should want to help generated genuine cooperation and commitment. Humor and acknowledgement of shared humanity were consistently more effective than solemnity and assertion of authority. People responded better to messages that treated them as intelligent partners rather than as subordinates who needed to be told what to think and do. The British transformation, learning what actually works. British poster design transformed dramatically and systematically through 1941 to 1942 as designers learned what actually worked through careful observation, systematic testing, and willingness to abandon approaches that failed, regardless of how much effort had gone into them. The Ministry of Information underwent crucial leadership change in July 1941, when Brendan Bracken replaced Lord Macmillan as minister, bringing much more sophisticated understanding of modern media and mass psychology gained from his background in journalism and publishing. Crucially, the ministry began actively recruiting professional advertising designers rather than continuing to rely on government bureaucrats who understood administrative procedures but not persuasive communication. These professionals, people who had spent entire careers figuring out how to sell products to skeptical consumers in competitive markets, understood intuitively that effective communication absolutely required understanding audience psychology, addressing audience concerns, and offering something audiences actually wanted, rather than simply telling them what they should want. Abram Games became one of the most important and influential British poster designers of the war, pioneering the distinctively British style that would define effective British wartime propaganda and influence poster design for decades afterward. Games had worked as a commercial designer before the war and understood from hard-won professional experience that effective visual communication required absolute clarity, deliberate simplicity, and immediate comprehension within seconds. His design philosophy was perfectly captured in a phrase he used throughout his long career: maximum meaning, minimum means. Games believed passionately that truly effective posters had to communicate their essential message instantly. Within the few seconds that someone walking past on a busy street would glance at the poster, without requiring viewers to stop and carefully study the image to understand what it meant. This philosophy led directly to designs that were radically simplified compared to the elaborate Nazi posters with their complex imagery and multiple elements. Games's approach featured several distinctive characteristics: severely limited color palettes, often using just 2 or 3 bold colors, rather than the complex multicolor lithography that Nazi posters employed, simple bold graphics rather than detailed naturalistic illustrations that required close examination to understand, clever visual metaphors that communicated complex ideas through a single powerful image that could be grasped immediately, and minimal text, usually just a short, memorable phrase, rather than lengthy explanation or argumentation. Games's 1942 poster, "Your Talk May Kill Your Comrades," perfectly exemplified his sophisticated approach and became one of the most memorable British posters of the war. The image showed a sailor drowning and sinking beneath ocean waves, but the waves were brilliantly formed from fragments of careless conversation. Words like ship, convoy, sailing, and destination were visible in the wave patterns that were drowning the sailor. The visual metaphor was instantly understandable even from a distance. Careless talk about ship movements and convoy routes could lead directly to German U-boat attacks that would sink ships and drown sailors. The poster didn't lecture viewers about security or threaten them with prosecution for security violations. It didn't list rules or regulations about what you could and couldn't say. It simply showed the consequence of careless talk clearly and dramatically in a single powerful image. If you talk carelessly about military matters in places where you might be overheard, soldiers and sailors will die as a direct result of your thoughtless words. The emotional impact of that simple, clear visual message was far more powerful and memorable than any amount of threatening or lecturing could ever have been. The Careless Talk Costs Lives campaign, designed by various artists but sharing a common sophisticated approach, became one of the most effective and culturally influential poster series of the entire war, demonstrating the remarkable power of humor combined with clear security messaging. The posters were designed by artists including Fougas, Cyril Kenneth Bird, and showed absurd or darkly humorous situations where careless talk could be overheard by enemy agents, making security consciousness seem like practical common sense rather than paranoid restriction on freedom. One justly famous poster by Fougas showed 2 middle-class women gossiping animatedly on a public bus, completely oblivious to Adolf Hitler and Hermann Göring sitting in the seat directly behind them, leaning forward and listening intently to every word of their conversation. The image was genuinely funny. Viewers laughed at the absurdity of Hitler and Göring riding a British bus in civilian clothes. But the serious security message was absolutely clear. You never know who might be listening to your conversation in public places. So be extremely careful what you say about military matters, troop movements, ship departures, or any information that could possibly help the enemy. The humor made the poster memorable and infinitely shareable. People told friends and co-workers about the poster with Hitler on the bus and repeated the security message while sharing the joke. The poster became embedded in popular culture in ways that stern official warnings never could have achieved. It was reproduced in newspapers, referenced in comedy radio shows and music hall performances, discussed in pubs and workplaces, and became part of the shared cultural vocabulary that shaped how people thought about wartime security. Another brilliant careless talk poster showed 2 businessmen in suits chatting casually at a pub bar, while Hitler's ominous shadow loomed dramatically on the wall behind them. cast by someone standing in the doorway behind them whose face we cannot see. The image suggested with chilling effectiveness that even familiar, comfortable places like your local pub could potentially have enemy agents or Nazi sympathizers, eavesdropping on conversations, listening for any useful intelligence that careless tongues might reveal. The shadow was a subtle but powerful threat, not showing an actual enemy, but suggesting their presence could be anywhere, could be anyone, making everyone appropriately cautious. A third version showed two well-dressed businessmen discussing something over lunch at an upscale restaurant, while the waiter serving them wore a Nazi swastika armband partially visible beneath his formal jacket. The image suggested that enemy agents might be working in ordinary jobs, looking like completely normal people, professionally trained to listen for useful information while performing apparently innocent work. The message made people think twice before discussing anything sensitive in semi-public places where service workers or strangers might overhear. The Careless Talk campaign succeeded brilliantly on multiple psychological levels that Nazi propagandists completely failed to understand or replicate. It used humor to make the security message memorable, repeatable, and culturally sticky rather than threatening or boring, which was the typical government approach. It made viewers complicit and active participants in security by encouraging them to watch for and gently correct others who might talk carelessly, rather than just passively remembering to watch their own behavior. It suggested a specific, concrete, understandable threat, enemy agents actively listening for useful intelligence, rather than abstract security concerns that seemed paranoid or exaggerated in peacetime conditioned minds. It made security consciousness feel like practical common sense and looking out for your community rather than government-imposed restriction on personal freedom of speech. British designers also learned to address specific audience segments with carefully tailored messages that connected directly to their particular concerns, motivations, and circumstances rather than using one-size-fits-all approaches. The Dig for Victory campaign, launched initially in October 1939, but significantly refined and expanded through 1940 and 1941, based on early results, encouraged home vegetable gardening to reduce national dependence on imported food that was vulnerable to German U-boat attacks in the Atlantic. The posters showed vegetables growing productively in home gardens, shared allotments, public parks, and even bombed-out lots, visually suggesting that every bit of available land could and should contribute to national food production and family food security. One memorable poster showed a boot digging forcefully into dark, rich soil, captioned simply, "Dig for Victory." The stark simplicity was visually striking, and the message was completely unmistakable. Another showed a happy family gathered around their dinner table, eating vegetables they'd grown themselves in their own garden, suggesting that home gardening was a practical, achievable way to ensure your family had enough nutritious food despite rationing and to contribute meaningfully to national food security. The poster brilliantly connected abstract war effort and national needs to concrete personal benefit that every family could immediately understand. Grow vegetables, feed your family better, contribute to reducing import dependence, all in one simple action. The Dig for Victory posters were remarkably effective because they addressed a genuine pressing concern, potential food shortages, with a practical, achievable solution that ordinary individuals could implement immediately without special training or resources. They didn't just demand abstract sacrifice for vague patriotic reasons. They provided concrete, specific action that gave people an immediate sense of contributing meaningfully to the war effort, while simultaneously benefiting their own families. The combination of patriotic contribution and practical family benefit was psychologically powerful and sustainable over years. By 1942, Britain had well over 1.5 million victory gardens, producing significant quantities of food that supplemented official rations and measurably reduced pressure on imported food supplies that had to run the U-boat gauntlet. The poster campaign was demonstrably, measurably successful in actually changing behavior at scale and contributing to national food security, proving that effective propaganda could achieve concrete results, not just manipulate attitudes. The American Revolution in Poster Design. American poster propaganda underwent a similar dramatic transformation after December 1941, when Pearl Harbor brought the United States into direct military involvement. Though American designers faced a fundamentally different challenge than their British counterparts. The American public, living safely thousands of miles from combat zones, hadn't experienced bombing raids, hadn't faced immediate invasion threat, hadn't seen enemy soldiers on their soil. The war seemed distant, abstract, and disconnected from daily American life. American posters needed to make a distant war feel personally relevant and urgent to people whose daily lives weren't directly threatened by enemy action and who might reasonably wonder why they should make sacrifices for conflicts happening on the other side of multiple oceans. The solution that American designers eventually discovered was connecting war effort to deeply personal motivations rather than abstract patriotism, protecting family from future threats, achieving victory faster to bring loved ones home sooner, supporting neighbors and relatives currently serving in military, contributing visibly to community collective effort, and building a demonstrably better post-war future for children. The Office of War Information, created in June 1942 under journalist and radio broadcaster Elmer Davis, coordinated propaganda efforts and learned remarkably quickly what worked with American audiences who were notably skeptical of government propaganda. Davis understood instinctively that Americans were deeply suspicious of being manipulated and resented being told what to think. Effective messaging absolutely needed to treat Americans as intelligent, independent-minded partners rather than subjects to be commanded or manipulated. Norman Rockwell's justly famous Four Freedoms poster series, based directly on Franklin Roosevelt's January 1941 State of the Union speech articulating American war aims, perfectly exemplified effective American propaganda that connected abstract political principles to concrete, recognizable American experiences and values. Rockwell painted four detailed, warmly humanistic scenes illustrating Roosevelt's four essential freedoms. Freedom of speech showed a working-class man in work clothes standing up to speak at a New England town meeting while his more prosperous neighbors listened respectfully, powerfully representing America's democratic tradition of free expression, regardless of social class or economic status. Freedom of worship showed people of visibly different faiths praying together. A Jewish man wearing a yarmulke, a Catholic woman with a rosary, a Protestant family with folded hands, representing America's religious pluralism and constitutional commitment to religious tolerance. Freedom from want showed an extended family gathered around a Thanksgiving dinner table with a turkey and all the traditional trimmings, representing American material prosperity and abundance that most of the world could only dream about. Freedom from fear showed parents tucking their children safely into bed at night, while the father held a newspaper with frightening war headlines, representing every parent's fundamental desire to protect their children from violence, danger, and fear. The paintings were reproduced as full-color posters and distributed through the Saturday Evening Post magazine, which printed them in 4 consecutive weekly issues in February and March 1943, with accompanying essays explaining their significance. The public response was absolutely overwhelming. Millions of requests for prints flooded in. Newspapers and magazines across America reproduced the images, and the Treasury Department immediately recognized their propaganda value for war bond campaigns. Rockwell's particular genius was making the war fundamentally about protecting familiar, beloved American ways of life rather than defeating abstract foreign threats that seem distant and irrelevant. The paintings showed concretely and emotionally what Americans were fighting for, these specific freedoms that defined American identity, these particular everyday experiences that made American life worth defending, this distinctive way of life that was threatened by fascist aggression and totalitarian ideology. The paintings deliberately weren't idealized propaganda, showing impossibly perfect people in luxurious circumstances. They showed real, recognizable Americans in completely ordinary situations. The man speaking at the town meeting wore work clothes and spoke with rough eloquence. The people praying were shown in genuine religious devotion with worn prayer books. The Thanksgiving table was solidly middle class rather than wealthy with fine china. The children's bedroom was modest and cozy rather than luxurious. The deliberate ordinariness made the emotional message powerful and authentic. This is your actual life that needs protecting. These are your real freedoms that are worth fighting for. This is what victory will preserve. The Saturday Evening Post reproduced the paintings in spectacular full color across 4 issues in early 1943, and they became an immediate cultural sensation that transcended their propaganda purpose. The Treasury Department brilliantly used them in a war bond campaign that toured the country and raised an astonishing $132 million, one of the most successful bond drives of the entire war, and proof that effective propaganda could directly change behavior and produce measurable results. The paintings toured the country in a traveling exhibition that drew enormous crowds everywhere it appeared, with people standing in long lines to see them. Rosie the Riveter became the enduring iconic image of American women's essential war work, though the term actually referred to multiple different poster images created by different artists with somewhat different visual styles. J. Howard Miller's famous 1943 poster, created for Westinghouse Electric, showed a woman in work clothes and polka-dot headscarf flexing her bicep with the confident caption, "We can do it." The image was genuinely empowering. The woman looked strong, confident, fully capable of any task, completely equal to male workers. The poster was actually initially used only internally at Westinghouse manufacturing facilities to boost morale among female workers and wasn't widely distributed as public propaganda during the war itself. But the powerful image captured American imagination and became a lasting symbol of women's capability that extended far beyond its immediate wartime purpose, influencing feminist movements for decades afterward. Norman Rockwell painted a completely different Rosie the Riveter for the May 29, 1943 Saturday Evening Post cover, showing a muscular, sturdy woman in work clothes eating her lunch while sitting confidently on an I-beam, a rivet gun resting across her lap, American flag hanging in the background behind her. This Rosie looked genuinely tough and capable, more like an idealized industrial worker than the somewhat glamorous woman in many other wartime images of female factory workers. Both distinct Rosie images successfully suggested that women were absolutely essential to war production and fully capable of competently performing traditionally male work. A revolutionary message that had profound implications extending well beyond immediate wartime labor needs. The posters helped fundamentally shift American cultural attitudes about women's capabilities and appropriate social roles in ways that would have lasting impact on gender relations and women's opportunities in post-war decades. American poster designers also pioneered the use of enemy caricature that was deliberately mocking and deflating rather than terrifying or aggrandizing, undercutting enemy pretensions while still maintaining the essential message that they needed to be defeated. Dr. Seuss, Theodore Geisel, already famous as a children's book author, produced political cartoons and poster designs for the Treasury Department and War Production Board that showed Axis leaders as buffoonish villains, genuinely dangerous and needing to be defeated, but also fundamentally ridiculous and mockable rather than impressively powerful. One memorable Seuss poster showed Hitler, Mussolini, and Tojo as three ugly, menacing faces peering through prison bars, captioned, "This is the enemy." The image was certainly menacing. The faces were deliberately drawn to look malevolent and cruel. But it also powerfully suggested that the enemy could be contained, defeated, and ultimately imprisoned like the criminals they were, rather than being invincible supermen who couldn't be stopped. Loose-lip sink ships became perhaps the single most famous and culturally enduring American security poster of the entire war, memorable for its perfect alliteration and crystal-clear message. The poster showed a ship sinking with drowning sailors struggling desperately in the water, while the caption warned that careless talk about ship movements, convoy routes, or military operations could lead directly to German U-boat attacks. The phrase was so perfectly memorable that it entered permanent American popular language and remains widely recognized today. Decades after the war ended and the specific security threat is long gone, the alliteration made it instantly catchy and easy to remember. The dramatic imagery was clear and emotionally powerful, and the core message was completely unmistakable. Your careless words can directly kill people, so think before you speak about anything related to military operations. The psychology of persuasion. Principles that actually work. Allied poster designers discovered through systematic practice, careful observation, and professional expertise several fundamental psychological principles that made propaganda genuinely effective at changing attitudes and behaviors. Principles that Nazi designers had either completely ignored or fundamentally misunderstood because of their ideological commitments. First crucial principle: people respond far better to messages carefully framed as personal benefit and self-interest, rather than abstract duty or ideological commitment to collective goals. Nazi posters consistently emphasized duty to nation, race, and Führer, asking and demanding that individuals sacrifice their interests for an abstract collective good. Allied posters emphasized concrete personal stakes and tangible individual benefits. Protect your specific family from future danger. Bring your loved ones home faster by working harder now. Ensure a demonstrably better future for your own children through victory. Contribute visibly to your community and be publicly valued for your patriotic effort. Second principle: humor and shared humanity consistently work better than intimidation and grandiose displays of power at generating genuine voluntary support. Nazi posters showed towering, idealized soldiers, dramatic theatrical lighting, and overwhelming displays of military power, carefully designed to intimidate and inspire fearful awe. Allied posters increasingly used gentle humor, recognizably human situations, and relatable everyday characters, designed to persuade through identification and shared humanity rather than intimidation and fear. Third principle: concrete, specific action requests work dramatically better than vague appeals to fight or sacrifice for abstract causes. Nazi posters often demanded faith in leadership or commitment to ideology without ever specifying what ordinary individuals should actually do in practical terms. Allied posters provided specific, achievable, concrete actions with clear purposes. Buy a specific dollar amount of war bonds to finance specific military equipment, save tin cans and scrap metal that will become specific weapons. Plant specific vegetables in victory gardens to reduce specific import needs. Avoid discussing specific topics that could aid enemy intelligence. join a specific military branch, or take a specific civilian defense job. Fourth principle, acknowledging sacrifice honestly while clearly emphasizing meaningful purpose works far better than denying hardship or simply demanding obedience without explanation. Nazi propaganda increasingly denied obvious difficulties or blamed enemies for problems Germans could see with their own eyes, leading to catastrophic credibility collapse. Allied posters honestly acknowledged that total war required genuine sacrifice and hardship, but carefully framed that sacrifice as meaningful contribution to shared victory and demonstrably better future worth achieving. Fifth principle, positive messaging, emphasizing desirable outcomes to work toward works far better than negative threat, emphasizing disasters to desperately avoid. Nazi posters increasingly emphasized dire threats. What would happen if Germany lost? What enemies would do to Germans? How desperate the situation was becoming? Why surrender meant certain death and destruction? Allied posters consistently emphasized positive, achievable outcomes. What victory would accomplish? How individual contributions helped bring that victory closer? What the world would look like after winning? How post-war life would be better than pre-war existence? The final accounting, the complete transformation in Allied poster effectiveness. From embarrassing disasters in 1939 to 1940 to sophisticated effective campaigns by 1942 to 1943, demonstrates that propaganda techniques can absolutely be learned through systematic effort. Democracies started at severe disadvantage because they lacked totalitarian propaganda experience, but they learned remarkably quickly through trial and error, professional expertise, and genuine willingness to abandon approaches that failed. Nazi Germany started with the advantage of years of sophisticated propaganda experience and a powerful apparatus, but fundamentally couldn't adapt when their approaches proved less effective than Allied methods. Real adaptation would have required abandoning core ideological assumptions, and that was literally impossible without ceasing to be a Nazi regime. They never expected Allied posters to outsmart Nazi propaganda. In 1939, Allied efforts were disasters, while Nazi posters were sophisticated. But through learning what worked and focusing on genuine persuasion rather than command, Allied designers transformed weakness into decisive strength in the battle for hearts and minds.